So welcome everyone to our investor briefing, Integrating Human Rights within Financial Decision Making. We will be exploring today how financial institutions are integrating human rights into their core business activities. In particular, we'll be learning more about a new publication by the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights and Finance and Human Rights, representing the latest iteration of a longitudinal study conducted since 2020 that identifies key trends, persistent challenges, and opportunities concerning the current state of human rights integration within financial decision-making in the European context. If we go forward a slide, I'll introduce you to our speakers we're going to hear from here. So we're going to start off hearing from Dorothee Baumann-Pauli, who's director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, who's actually on the next slide. As well, if we go back a slide, we're going alphabetically here, her colleague Berit Knuck, who is a senior research associate. And the two of them will be presenting on the methodology behind the report, as well as some of the key findings. Then we are going to turn to, next slide, Charles Muller, who is the chair of Finance and Human Rights. And Charles is going to be contextualizing the study's insight within the larger European financial industry, as well as within the context of significant developments around the omnibus proposal and the implications of those for the findings. As we'll hear in a second, for those of you who are not aware, the omnibus proposal is an effort to simplify some key sustainability legislation within the EU. Then we're going to turn to Amanda Zillig, Global Human Rights Lead at ING Bank, and Amy Carr, Senior Shareholder Advocate at Friends Fiduciary. And the two of them will be providing a practitioner's perspective on how their organizations go about integrating human rights systematically into their business practices. They're going to talk a bit about the effects of those legislative developments on their efforts to systematically address human rights, as well as some outstanding challenges and some potential ways to overcome those and pathways forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doro and Berit. Thanks so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to your team for setting us up and starting us off. I'm looking forward to today's exchange. Just a bit of background to the study we just published. We launched the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights in 2019, and at the time there was a big finance event also being launched in Geneva. Now that is the biggest sustainable finance event in Switzerland. And we scanned the agenda and it was void of any human rights content. So we decided as we launched, this needs to change. Sustainable finance is not just climate. Climate and human rights belong inextricably together. And so since we've been contributing to this sustainable finance event with our specific human rights perspective, and in this context, we were really lucky to find a partner to first do a taking stock exercise, namely what role do human rights play in the financial service industry. And together with Charles Muller, you will hear from him in a second, Finance and Human Rights, and Luxembourg for Finance, a public-private partnership in Luxembourg, we were able to start a series of surveys of financial institutions in Europe, trying to understand where do they stand on human rights? How do they implement human rights? What importance do they give human rights? And where do they see the current challenges? And so we indeed conducted this survey 3 times now. So you're certainly aware also of the many methodological biases that affect surveys, but the more frequently you do them, the more interesting they get, I would argue. And you can see trends over time. So we conducted the first survey in 2020, the second in 2022, and then again in 2024. Of course, before the world changed quite significantly, and we see trends over time. Berit will now explain to you the methodology in greater detail, and then we'll get to key findings.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Doro. On the next slide, you can actually see the 3 studies that we've conducted since 2020. And I will now give you a short overview of how we conducted the study and also what our key findings were in the last edition of this longitudinal study. So on the next slides, you can see our methodology. The study focuses on financial institutions in Europe, and in particular on banks, asset managers, and insurance companies. We conducted the study for the 3rd edition in 2024 and released the report earlier this year. Now, as in previous years, we collected the data through a survey and made minor updates to reflect, for example, regulatory developments, but also to maintain consistency. And this time around, we collected more responses than in previous years. We had 75 answers from respondents in about 15 countries from Europe in total. Most of the responses were actually in senior positions and also work as in sustainability functions and on human rights. So the answers reflect the respondents' own perception, but they speak from the perspective of their institution. And we are aware that the respondents likely have above average experience with sustainability and human rights. We complemented the findings from the survey with 10 expert interviews, and same here, almost all experts were finance practitioners who actually work in the industry and held senior positions. And you can see here that we focused on 6 core themes for the study, including the general approach to human rights, what are the policy commitments, but also the engagement with clients, the impact of regulatory developments, the challenges that companies face, and also the drivers and how human rights are organized internally. So let's continue on this next slide with our key findings. We want to highlight 3 key insights from this study. So first, compared to previous years, we found that awareness levels for human rights are high, and also the acknowledgement that human rights are part of the fiduciary duty of financial institutions. And these awareness levels have continuously increased since the beginning of this study. And this year, we found that about 3/4 of the respondents have a formal human rights approach and also address human rights with their clients. But at the same time, we also found that human rights are usually part of bigger sustainability or ESG engagements and not really a standalone topic. Despite this, we also find that financial institutions could do more to act on that. And one of the key constraints that came up in the survey is that there are not enough internal resources and expertise on the topic. So building the management capacity on human rights remains an important topic in order to overcome the current situation where human rights are often either treated more generically or anecdotally with deeper engagement. The second key finding is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the strongest drivers to engage on human rights are regulatory developments and reputational risks. And this also seems to have gotten stronger over the years. So this time in particular, we found that this is the key driver, and other drivers such as questions from societal expectations, from employees, from clients have become less important in comparison. So there is room to do more, and this is also what we heard in the expert interviews, and we'll have time to discuss how financial institutions actually become more proactive later in this webinar when we hear from our guests from practice. The third key finding is that one of the main challenges to do more is in obtaining detailed and reliable and also comparable data on investee companies' human rights performance. In the survey, more than half of the respondents indicated that better data would help them to be better able to address human rights. And also close to 1/2 of the respondents said that actually the lack of data prevents them from engaging on human rights with investee companies. And this challenge, of course, does not only relate to financial institutions, but also extends to rating agencies and the data that investee companies themselves can provide. Now, on the next slide, we want to highlight some of the quotes that we received in the expert interviews. I won't go through all of them. You will receive the slides after this webinar, but let me highlight a few points here. So one expert remarked that while investors are increasingly raising concerns around climate and nature and are outspoken on these topics, this is not the case for human rights. And this is important because if we talk about sustainable finance more broadly, then the element of human rights might get lost in these discussions. And also this leads to a situation that internally little resources get devoted to actually improve human rights management. So one of the reasons that this expert highlighted was that human rights are not always understood well or perceived as being material. And this is something that other experts highlighted as well, that awareness for human rights that I mentioned in the beginning is not the same as an actual in-depth understanding. So that's one of the key themes that we found. Another important comment pointed out that there is a need for more industry-specific initiatives, both in relation to coming up with more effective standards as a means and as a means to increase leverage through collaboration. And this also leads us to our conclusions. And with that, I would like to hand over to Dorothy to talk about our recommendations on the next slide.
Thanks, Berit. So indeed, when we conduct research, we also want to translate research findings into actionable recommendations. And here you see the targets of our recommendations: financial institutions, trade bodies, policymakers, investee companies and clients, and data providers. For now, given the audience, I will focus on the financial institutions. So we recommend that financial institutions invest more resources to building internal human rights management capacity. This was a consistent barrier to advancing the work across the three surveys we conducted. The individuals that responded to our survey often said we're so stretched on time, and just there's just not enough of us. Another consistent finding that needs to be translated into action is that companies, as you heard from Berit, are not getting good performance data on human rights. There's a lot of formal data on human rights, like is there a human rights policy, etc., but nothing that relates to actual impacts. And so I think we also, as academics, need to see a role for us here to advance better data for financial service institutions. In expert conversations, people tell me that the reporting guidelines from the European Union should bring betterment, but let's see what Charles has to say about this. We definitely need better performance data. Also consistently pointed out was, well, we are so small, we care about this. So how can we catalyze collective engagement to increase leverage over investee companies? How can we monitor progress at the level of investee companies? That's something that financial institutions do very rarely. They have long-term engagements, but consistently measuring how those investee companies advance over time is rarely done. And we believe that financial institutions could also request independent impact assessments from corporations to have independent third party and not just the reports that companies put out about themselves as a key database for their assessment. So lots to do, but next, Charles Muller will speak, who's really an expert on the developments at the EU level. And as you heard from Berit, we certainly saw the ups and downs of the developments around CSDDD. And in the latest survey, we saw sort of financial institutions relaxing a bit over the fact that they are probably not included in CSDDD. Which I think is the wrong reaction. But Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Doro. Thank you very much to the organizer of the webinar, and also to Doro and Berit for the continued support in the series of surveys that we are doing with Luxembourg for Finance. You just mentioned, Doro, CSDDD, so that's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, very complicated name for a very complicated topic indeed, because the CSDDD was adopted by the last European Parliament just days before the elections. And why did they quickly adopt this? It was a compromise between all sorts of different things, because they knew that after the European election, probably the majority in the European Parliament would change, and even that compromise between what the industry wanted and the lobby groups wanted and the civil society wanted would even be different at that stage. So the compromise in the CSDDD was that financial institutions would not have specific additional requirements to those that any other companies would have, but Article 36 was requiring the Commission to go back and to produce a report and come back with a specific report on potential additional requirements. So the topic of potential additional requirements was not dealt with in CSDDD, but was a topic that the European Commission should come back to. Now, what has happened? There is a new European Parliament, there is a new EU Commission, and the EU Commission in February 2025, so just when we issued the report, came back with the so-called Omnibus Directive. So Omnibus means that a lot of things are being tackled. The aim of the Omnibus Directive was, in the eyes of the Commission, to simplify quite a lot of things, but distractors say it's not simplification, it's abolishment. And among the things that are being simplified away is this famous Article 36, which required the EU Commission to have a closer look to financial institutions. So that Article 36 in the eyes of the Commission should fall away, which would mean that there would be no specific additional requirements for financial institutions in the foreseeable future. Now, Omnibus is for the moment still a proposal. It's not a final decision, but if it goes through, and many observers say it will go through, then CSDDD would be the first European directive that has been altered before it even has come into force. That will be a first, a sad first. So where do financial institutions stand? And I'm an independent director on quite a few funds and also a bank. There is a lot of goodwill to try and do something, and I think our study also showed this. It's not that people are against trying to work on the issue. There are some voluntary standards, like the principles for responsible investing or the principles for responsible banking. The big question, obviously, is liability. What do I need to do in order to make sure that I will not suddenly fall short of any legal obligations I might have? So that's the biggest concern. And then the other thing that is obviously being looked at very closely for the moment is the things that are happening in the US. And what I see with my clients and more generally in the industry is that we are going from perhaps a greenwashing attitude where we are promising more than we can keep, to an attitude of green hushing, where we do some things, but we certainly don't want to talk too much about it, given the most recent developments. So in the very short time frame that I have, and that this is in a nutshell what I wanted to comment on regarding the study.
Fantastic, Charles. This was the most concise overview I've ever heard, I think, of what's currently going on.
Thank you.
Your observations, we will reflect them now with the two practitioners. Rebecca, will you introduce them?
Absolutely, Doro. Once again, so we are going to be speaking with Amanda Zillig from ING. She's the Global Human Rights Lead, and Amy Carr, Senior Shareholder Advocate at Friends Fiduciary. Over to you, Doro.
Thank you so much. So Amanda, first to you. So you're at ING. Tell us a bit more about how does ING set incentives for investee companies to address human rights systematically, and perhaps you can provide a really concrete example.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to be here today and to talk about business and human rights. I think it's important to bring the topic to discussion and also share practices so we learn from each other. So, Doro, now addressing your question. Your question is about investee companies. So I will address ING's role as a provider of lending to corporates, because as a bank, we also have different roles. We are an employee. We also provide finance to individuals. We are procurer of services and goods. So each one of those roles, they require different types of assessments to identify how we can prevent, mitigate, and address actual human rights impact. So, but the important thing to bring here is that we have a role as a business overall, right? Under the UN guiding principles is to respect human rights. So we should have appropriate due diligence processes and policies in place to identify, prevent, mitigate, and address actual and human rights impacts. So going back a bit, ING has had a human rights policy, a dedicated human rights policy since 2018. So we embedded that into existing toolings in our systems to measure human rights, our clients' performance on environmental and social risks. So this way, we can prioritize which transactions or financing we have high risk, we have identified as high risk, and carry out an enhanced due diligence. So, and this way, we can also use our leverage to identify, yes, and engage with our clients on potential risks that may exist.
Thank you, Amanda. Let's say one more beat on the leverage. How do you create leverage over investee companies? You're one financier, so are you collaborating with others, or I just often hear we're just one small, and these are big companies, and so how do you deal with the lack of leverage, or how do you create leverage?
Well, I think, of course, the diligence that we carry out may identify potential risks. So the question needs to be asked. It's not, we can maybe 1 or 20, but it's our role to also ask the question and understand how companies respond to that. So this is why it's important to look at the guidance documents, the soft law elements that we have in there, like the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, to help us understand and have a risk-based approach. And then these help us to prioritize, like I said, on our efforts on this enhanced due diligence. And based on that, there will be an advice, right? It can be positive, it can be negative, but it can also be a conditional one, positive conditions. So this is how we can also steer and see how the client is progressing.
Thank you. That's really interesting, the conditional acceptance. I'll come back to you in a second. So Amy, over to you. In your engagement with investee companies, how are you approaching the human rights controversies that break in the news? And can you maybe point to engagement that led to actual successes in terms of you engaged with a company and they actually changed their corporate strategy?
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me here today. Yeah, so just quickly on Friends Fiduciary, we're a Quaker faith-based investment firm. So, we are investing according to our Quaker values, but a lot of the work that we do as well is really direct engagement with the companies that we hold when we have an issue or a concern that comes up. And so when we're engaging companies specifically around kind of human rights controversies, we're framing it really in terms of risk mitigation, mitigating risks to companies by identifying, assessing, and addressing their human rights or potential negative human rights impacts. And this is, within their entire value chain, upstream, downstream, and really just from our view, framing it as identifying legal, reputational, regulatory risks to companies, even though kind of our moral side of it is around the negative human rights impacts that we're concerned about. And so, we're looking for global corporate human rights policies, but we're also looking at how those policies are translating to company practice or investee practice. And so, kind of not only having that policy, but the due diligence process that's in place as the UNGPs kind of call for, And so having those due diligence processes in place in order to mitigate risk. And we're also really in these engagements looking for kind of a proactive approach from companies. So conducting due diligence, not just when negative human rights impacts are discovered, but kind of having that process in place, indicating, when this due diligence triggers a human rights impact assessment or something like that for certain products, or, based on the context that certain operations are in, and then potential negative human rights occurring. I think we do have a decent example of some inspired company change. I won't name any names at this point, but we have engaged in the past kind of a larger parent company of several dating apps. And this was following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was a huge displacement of Ukrainian people, including, the most vulnerable women and children. And Interpol reporting was coming out that dating service apps were being kind of co-opted by bad actors to in that region for the purpose of human trafficking. And so, that to us was a clear potential negative human rights risk for the company operating. They didn't have physical operations in Russia, but they were continuing their services. And so that to us was a clear risk that needed to be mitigated. And so also in our research with the company, they didn't have a policy in place. So without the policy, it's hard to have the practice. And, in our engagement as well, they had an advisory committee actually made up of experts on human trafficking and kind of other sexual abuse, sexual violence issues. So we started out dialoguing with the company. We did eventually have to kind of escalate it to a investor resolution, shareholder resolution. But, I think in that conversation, we're seeing the company kind of arguing that they didn't have any direct impacts, but they had indirect impacts that were still creating risk for them. And, after several conversations with them, they eventually did decide to discontinue their services in Russia, which I think was a positive at the time, as it not really being an essential good and kind of creating a risk for the populations there. But what was important for us is that, we asked them to put a policy in place, and they did. And then, later on, following our conversations with them, they also choose to discontinue their services in Belarus, which was not necessarily something we asked of them directly. But for us, it's about, that to us was having kind of policy and practice in place, due diligence in place, where they're making those decisions now just based on the decision-making procedures they now have. So that was one engagement we thought was positive.
A fantastic example. Thank you so much for sharing. Of course, our audience is now really keen to hear what's going on right now. Our survey ended in 2024. We all know the world has changed since. So Charles alluded to, he hears from his partners that there's a lot of green hushing going on. I would just love to hear from you, Amanda, what's going on inside of ING, as much as you can share, since the omnibus is still, creating a lot of uncertainty in terms of what will really happen. Has that changed your internal conversations around social and environmental sustainable finance? Give us some insights into your work life right now.
It's been busy.
Yes.
Okay. I think it's important to start saying that sustainability at the heart is one of the two strategic pillars of ING. So that sets the scene where we want to continue doing business in a way that planet and people are just important as economic growth. So that's how we conduct, and that's how we are still doing things. Of course, we track what is happening out there, and not only in Europe, but around the world. And because we need to understand what is the impact of those regulations to our operations, where we need to focus our efforts as well. But ING continues to be committed to its sustainability goals. But it's also, I also mentioned, we welcome simplification, but it's of things. So it's important to understand how things align together. I think that's an important angle in there. We welcome that. But it's also on the soft law element. I believe that continuing to embed this in existing policies and processes is key for these uncertain times. So I'm talking about the OECD guidelines for multinational purposes, as I mentioned before, and the UN guiding principles. Because this is also a way to help us manage, we're talking about reputational risk, but also litigation and mediation risk even.
That's great to hear. You're holding the line. Amy, similar question to you. Arguably, the headwinds in the US are even stronger than in Europe. Have you already noticed changes in your engagement with investee companies? Are these conversations different now? And what main arguments are you using to make the case for human rights?
Yeah, great question. I think, I think it goes without saying that regulation in the US is probably trailing behind the EU, certainly. And so, I think our approach for my institution hasn't changed because we're guided by our Quaker values. And so, things that kind of fall under the buzzwords of like ESG or DEI and other human rights related issues. We're going to continue to work on those issues because we always kind of argue we've been working on them before they were these terms in the first place. Quakers have always been worried about kind of where their money is going and how it's being used. But I think when it comes to kind of having the conversation with companies, we believe Quaker values are good business values, but it's really about protecting long-term shareholder value. And so, as Amanda was kind of saying, that the sustainability issues that it impacts on people and planet, double materiality assessments, those are just another facet of kind of ensuring long-term shareholder value in our eyes. And so, when we're talking to companies, we're certainly seeing kind of, as Charles was saying as well, less public-facing material coming out and trying to kind of avoid having necessarily some kind of target on your back. But I think a lot of the companies we are talking to are continuing to do this work because they see the value of it as risk mitigation in their company practices. And so, I think when we're talking to companies, they're continuing this work because it's important for risk mitigation, but whether they're willing to kind of advertise or kind of make it public, I think that's something that companies are struggling with right now as well.
Yeah, you're rooted in such strong values that you're particularly resistant, I think, to an environment that is attacking, fundamental concepts that have underpinned that industry in the recent years. So let's conclude our study also, asked about the challenges and barriers to advance human rights in financial institutions. And the feedback was quite consistent, but I'd love to hear first from you, Amanda, again, what challenges, internal challenges you see to do the work that you do, and how are you working on overcoming them?
Yeah, sure. ING it's a large bank with operations globally. So it's very easy to work in silos. So having teams spread around the world working on the same topic in different ways. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a challenge, how to translate the requirements on a group level and escalate it down to the organization on different countries with different regulations and have an universal approach. I feel like this is a challenge. In terms of business and human rights, information is very qualitative, so it depends on individual analysis. So it also requires training and capacity building on the topic. So I also find this is still a challenge. And I think for me, I spend a good amount of my time engaging with the different stakeholders across the organization, right? Because like I said, it's not only our role as a lender, but we are also provider of financial services to individuals. We are also an employer. So it's to align everything and putting into practice, to make that link into practice, that's a challenge still. Mm.
Amanda, thanks. You also contributed to our study. And indeed, the need for training is something that came up over and over again, just the internal connecting the dots between departments. You don't need training, Amanda, but maybe colleagues in other departments need to see the connections to their day-to-day business. Amy, to you again. In your conversations, you may also sometimes hit a wall and wonder who else could help me make the case. Have you ever tried to form collective engagements with other value-driven investors that could support you? Is there collective, have you ever tried to catalyze collective action across like-minded organizations to address investee companies?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and that's actually something we're often trying to do. We're trying to work with other values-based investors. We think it just adds strength to the investor voice, and it allows the company to meet with many concerned investors at once. And kind of helps identify there's multiple investors that feel that you could be doing better on this issue. So here are our thoughts on how we can maybe help you do that. When we're talking to a company. But we also kind of will work with subject matter experts or NGOs as well, to kind of have the best information that we can. And there's been times too when we'll be somewhat part of a coalition. For example, we engaged semiconductor companies recently with a coalition of individual values-based investors. We were part of a values-based investor group meeting with these companies. There was kind of individual larger investor asset managers also meeting with these companies. We're meeting with these companies kind of in tandem. And so I don't want to say there was peer pressure for the companies, but it was kind of allowing them all to move forward on the issue at the same time instead of one kind of going out on a limb and putting best practice in, to be the first company to do that. So those engagements have been successful, and I think it's because of the partnership with others that make it more effective.
Sounds great. If anyone on the call now thinks I want to be part of your collective action, could they reach out to you?
Yes, of course. We're always looking for just anyone to work with to help.
Excellent. And just final follow-up question. So the term DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, has become such a toxic term now in the context of the US business environment. But what other topics do you think you could work on and advance collectively in the next few years? Is there maybe broader consensus on some human rights challenges that we're concerned about? Assuming that some of your collective action also revolves around very specific themes or industries.
Yeah, I think human rights work specifically, I think particularly in the US, one avenue that I think could be helpful in moving the work forward is kind of the workers' rights angle. I think that's something that's been, I know there's kind of some group work around that right now, but I think it kind of covers a lot of, when we're talking about DEI, it covers a lot of DEI issues. So, living wage is connected to, diversity, equity, inclusion issues, worker safety, equal pay. So I think kind of having that overarching topic and then kind of gets at those little systemic issues that you can kind of incorporate into those conversations as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. This gave a flavor of what's currently going on. Now I see there questions have come in through the chat function, and I now hand back over to Rebecca to moderate the discussion with the audience.
Thanks so much, Doro, and really thanks for that engaging conversation, Amy and Amanda. I really appreciate that. I encourage anyone who's has a question to pose it in the chat. We have a few that did come up. I'm going to start with some maybe more specific ones before getting to some maybe bigger overarching questions. I think this one is probably from Sophia Kramer, meant for you, Doro and Barrett. You had mentioned the need for more sector-specific guidance. Just a question from Sophia, if you got a sense from your interviews or surveys whether or not financial institutions are aware of existing OECD sector-specific guidance on implementing the OECD guidelines. Did you get a sense if that's something that also for institutional investors as well, there's a sector-specific guidance? Did you get a sense of kind of the understanding and depth of knowledge around some of these international tools that are out there?
Yes, maybe I can answer this question. That was part of our survey. We also asked the respondents what guidelines that are out there they used, and we found that the guidelines that were mostly used are the ones from the UN, like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, very classic one. Also the Principles for Responsible Investment. OECD guidelines, yes, as well. But then we also found that compared to previous years, there's a decrease in the need for guidelines, but there's a greater need for really specific data on company performance. So companies are starting to build this human rights expertise and now need actual data from companies.
And I'm going to come right back to that data question here in a second. I first want to, though, follow up on a question that Bharti Patel had posed initially to Amanda, who I think directed Bharti to report. But Amy, you had also mentioned about engaging with subject matter experts in civil society organizations. So the question was, do you engage with leaders in not-for-profits where they monitor company practices, good or bad practices? So maybe, I don't know if Amanda, you want to elaborate a bit on what's in your report, or Amy, you want to speak to that, but can you talk to us about how you go about engaging subject matter experts or civil society organizations who might be themselves very much preoccupied with monitoring company performance? And maybe Amanda, starting with you.
Yes, of course. So it's part of our job, right, to engage with non-profit, not-for-profit associations. And I will give a few examples that we are part of working groups where the World Benchmark Analysis are part of. We also engage with SHIFT, which is the expert center on business and human rights, also a non-profit part of the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, financial institution, social community group. So there are different working groups that we collaborate and participate in on the advocacy angle, and also engagements with civil society organizations occurs on it's part of the job. And I can talk a lot about different types of engagements that we have. So I also would like to mention the work that is done for ING's Human Rights Report. So the latest report was published last year, and I invite you all to look at it because it explains how we use our leverage, the work that is being done behind the scenes, and there's also an engagement table in there that provides an example of engagements that are conducted. So it will help give a bit of flavor on the approach that we have in more detail.
Great, and I think that sounds like a very good practice around disclosure. If you happen to have the link to your human rights report, maybe you could reference the page
yes, of course.
With that engagement table. I bet you the audience would love to take a closer look at that. Thanks, Amanda. And turning it over to you, Amy, can you elaborate a bit on your engagement efforts with stakeholders?
Yeah, so, I do wish we had kind of a more systemic process for engaging with stakeholders. We are honestly, rely on kind of our investor network groups that have been able to kind of bring investors together with NGOs, with other stakeholders. So including like ICCR, series, those are the investor network groups that we're a part of. And it's been helpful kind of having connections made through those groups and speaking with other investors who have worked with other NGOs. And if you're working on the same topic, it's kind of easy to get connected that way. So I wish we had a more standard process, but that's really how we've been kind of doing it.
Yeah, well, but I think in many ways, depending on the issue, there are going to be different stakeholders that you need to engage. So yeah, it needs to be tailored no matter what. So I'm going to turn now to a data question. One of the findings that Doro and Barrett presented from the study was that financial institutions are hampered by a lack of reliable human rights data. And I think that's certainly a refrain that we as the Investor Alliance hear a lot from our members. So question from Sam Jones at Heartland Initiative. The recommendation related to ESG data providers on human rights is a regular refrain among financial institutions. However, with a combination of US-based anti-ESG political pressure, Charles was just talking about that, a lack of unified demand for better human rights data by financial institutions, as well as watered down regulation demand in Europe, how do we expect data providers to respond? What are the alternatives? So I don't know, that's a big one. I don't know if anyone wants to step up first to offer some remarks on that question.
I'm happy to start us off. So when I talk to banks that, pay for the service to receive ESG data, they all tell me it's not good. They're not happy with what they're getting, particularly around the S. Because as Amanda pointed out, this is, often not neatly fitting into a quantifiable measure. It's a qualitative data. And yeah, the S often barely touches upon the salient issues accident rates, women on board. It's a very narrow understanding of the S. And the experts inside the banks are not happy with what they're getting. And I keep saying to them, revolt, go out there and complain and get together with your peers and complain jointly that you demand better data. But of course, the crux for better data is also the fact that we often need industry-specific standards for true metrics. And unless these are applied, it's very difficult to get to comparable data. But yeah, the demand, I think, should come from the people who pay for the service, and they should get together and complain collectively.
Thanks, Doro. Amy and Amanda, any chances we can see some collective mobilization? I should note there is an investor initiative for human rights data that was started by the Church of England, Aviva, and Scottish Widows, which I know that information is publicly available. They are engaging a number of big data providers. Amy, Amanda, from your perspectives, also there's a follow-up question from Sophia Gonzalez, a sub-question number 3. How, for practitioners, how do you think you could obtain the right data you need to better engage with your investee companies and clients? So how are you guys going about addressing that gap? I mean, we know there's certainly someone up here had mentioned ETI publishing some of its performance reporting of company members. We know that there's efforts like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, part of one of many benchmarks offered by the World Benchmarking Alliance. So Amy, Amanda, what are you going to do, and what are you using as an ersatz for now?
I can go first. Then Amy. Yes, like I said, the human rights impact analysis that's done mostly is qualitative, so it's based on a questionnaire that it's done. Again, if people want to know the process, I invite you all to read the human rights report. It takes a lot of effort and time to do it, so please look at it. But what is happening? There are certain initiatives like the WBA, the World Benchmark Analysis. They are coming up with an assessment and information on how companies, a set of companies, are performing. So it's a database that can be used. Rating agencies, they of course they have a set of data that can be linked on, for example, controversies and more on adverse media and reactions, also on policy management. So you can work with it as an addition, I see now, to the qualitative analysis that has to be done. So for now, I believe that both work well together, but it requires a lot of time and effort to implement. It's not only having the data available, but making sure it works and it's aligned with the current processes. And the rollout of processes take time to implement. So it's not, okay, is the data available, but it may be, but how to use this in the most effective way that can actually provide you context and accurate information. I think that's the challenge still.
Thanks, Amanda.
So
yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if that maybe Amy wants to compliment. Sorry, Rebecca.
No, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to pick up in a second what you said about kind of the challenge of getting the resources together to do that kind of analysis and figure out how to actually activate and use that data. But Amy, please do add anything you want to add.
Honestly, I don't have much to add. I think both of those answers were great. I would just agree with, you know, kind of, I think they need to hear from their clients, especially their larger clients. If you want to have effective change, I think that's the best way to do it. I know I think there's some investor groups, doing that engagement now, but yeah, I think clients will have the best leverage there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to add, because there was an expectation about the outcomes of CSRD reporting and the information that would be available from the CSRD, right? So I think we are still in the process of knowing the kind of information that will be available to us in terms of disclosure. So there may be an element in there about how companies are reporting on certain metrics and indicators on the S part, depending on the topics that are materials. So I think there are, there's still a lot to understand what is coming next in terms of data availability especially for this year, which is the first CSRD year. I see Dorothy noting, so that's my expectation, that we may have more information as well available.
And maybe let me turn just briefly to Charles. You know, obviously the negotiations under the omnibus are happening right now as we speak, but we've seen some initial indications of which way the Commission's leaning and maybe the Council as well. Are we going to be able to expect more and better data to make up for this gap that we're seeing from large ESG data providers? Do you want to maybe take a look into your crystal ball and make some predictions?
I don't think that the better data is the main concern of those who are for the moment negotiating and talking about the omnibus directive. What I see from my clients is that sometimes there is a lack of alignment between the clients on what good data is. So the poor data providers sometimes are in a situation where the clients complain that the data is bad, but for different diverging, sometimes opposite reasons. So good data is a topic in itself, and it's a real challenge, I think, for everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to another question that Sophia Gonzalez had asked. This is more so for you, Doro and Barrett. She inquires, you spoke to different financial actors, banks, asset managers, insurance companies. Did you find any differences in your findings among them? And then second part to that question, you mentioned most of them said they were small teams and had little resources, something, Amanda, you were also saying a second ago there. Little resources. Is this true also for very large investors that you spoke with? Is there any difference between institutional investors, private equity, and et cetera, in terms of, I guess, the size of teams and resources?
It's a very good question, and we would actually also like to get more information on that. But given our sample, we cannot make a statistically robust analysis of this, so we don't have a statement on that. But regarding the second question, if there are differences between smaller and larger investors or companies, we only picked statements for the presentation that are kind of representative of what we heard across the board. And one important distinction to make here is also that it's a difference whether you have enough resources to meet human rights due diligence requirements on a rather generic, abstract level, or whether you have the resources to actually assess human rights impact and follow through. And there we heard that most respondents or interview partners across the board struggle with that part.
Thank you. Dora, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Oh, just to say, generally, there are a lot more resources for the environmental experts assessing assets than human rights experts. There's a Swiss bank in Geneva that told me proudly we have like 18 people working on climate, assessing climate risk. And I said, and how many on human rights? And they were like, oh, they also do that. And I was like, no, hang on. There's different expertise. Please hire 50 more. It's complicated.
Yeah, I tend to agree on that one. Okay, and I think we have time for one final question. This one is from Juana Lee. It's directed to you, Amanda. Can you speak to ING's grievance mechanisms and approach to providing access to remedy when direct or indirect human rights risks occur in your lending, financing, or investment activities?
Yeah. Again, please read the human rights report. You will find more information about because then we detail everything in there. But what is important here is the role of a financial institution when we are providing finance and the due diligence behind it. So we use our leverage to enable remediation, to enable the access to remedy. So in there, I also would like to highlight, okay, we have different roles, and as a bank, again, so the And then it relates back to the UN guiding principles on causing, contributing, and direct link to. So that will determine the level of remediation. So, and I would like to point people to the recent UNEPify human rights tool that provides examples on that. So that's clear on the role of a bank, and also linked to the linkages on direct link to. So for that, when we receive a request for finance, we assess what are the types of grievance mechanisms that our clients have, if they have complaints channels, how that is working, so we can use our leverage to enable this remediation. So again, I invite Guanale to read the human rights report and understand what are the processes in there to make sure that it's clear. But of course, I'm happy to answer questions after the session if there are any on this topic as well.
Thank you, Amanda. And I'm getting a sense you put a lot of work in that report and you want people to take a look at it. So I encourage everyone to do so. I know those are massive undertakings to create. So
wow, you got the message?
Yeah. Okay, great. So we are getting ready to close here. I just want to see if there's any final words that any of our presenters want to offer before we close up.
Just thank you for the great collaboration with you, Rebecca, and everyone else.
Thanks to all of you too. No, and that's a yes. Thanks to all of our speakers and the center, and also Charles, Finance and Human Rights. Please do take a look at the report. It's very readable. A lot of good information in there. Really kind of parsing out trends over the last 3 years. We will be sending out the slides. We'll be sending out this recording. And yeah, encourage you to follow up with any of us based on what was said to here today, any interest that you may have, and wishing all of you a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.